and back to PXRF as well. So before I start, I would also like to give another shameless plug to the Journal of Polynesian Archaeology and Research, where you can find a much longer version of this paper in the first edition, I hear. Yeah. Okay. So stone powders are considered by archaeologists to be a later Polynesian invention, around 1400 AD. They were used for food, medicine, and pigment processing, and their distinctive forms, especially those from the Society Islands and the Marquesas, are easily recognized. The geochemical results presented in this paper will investigate if the tiki-headed pounders from the Marquesas were produced from localized basalt sources. There is also potential to investigate if the production of Marquesan pounders changed during the historical period. And there's some issues, though, establishing the distribution patterns of these iconic pounders in this later period because it is complicated by Western interactions. So a Marquesan pounder that I came across in the Pitt Rivers Museum collection, it was actually part of the founding collection of the museum, came with a few issues because the original collector was not easily identifiable from the museum accession notes. So the curator, Jeremy Coote, who was former head of the joint head of the collections at the Pitt Rivers Museum, found evidence that Lane Fox, later Pitt Rivers, displayed a West Indies mullah and 2 Tahitian mullahs in 1870 at an ordinary meeting of the Ethnological Society in London. The objects were recorded in Pitt Rivers' Blue Book over here. He sort of suggested that this probably could have been collected by Charles D. Boy on the HMAS Topaz on a voyage during the Pacific between 1868 to 69. But he did question that this would be kind of surprising because how could its Marquesan provenance be forgotten so quickly? And he sort of based this assumption on the comparative collection in the University of Pennsylvania, which includes 2 tiki-headed pounders, but they have the smaller eyes. So to investigate further, we need to consider some earlier suspects. So there's the usual suspects in this game, really. Again, I've considered more in the paper, but to solve who's done it, we really need to go to the archives and library and take a gun with us. So our first suspect, James Cook, of course, who made his first voyage to the Marquesas in 1774 aboard the Resolution. It is possible one of his ship's company collected the tiki-headed pounder during this voyage. This is especially plausible as Cook had given his crew permission to individually barter for goods ashore while anchored in Baitahu Bay, Santa Cristina, between the 8th and the 11th of April in 1774. There are actually 25 Marquesan objects collected by the Forsters from the Resolution in the Pitt Rivers Museum, including the Tahitian pounders and adzes that are collected here as well. However, Coote and Nicholas Thomas and others have explored that correctly identifying and locating objects from Cook's voyages are not really a straightforward task. And of course, there were several collectors on board Cook's voyages, notably Joseph Banks and the Forsters. And as Melinda pointed out yesterday, the Forsters were quite impressed with the breadfruit growing on the Marquesas. So over a dozen Marquesan objects in the Pitt Rivers Museum, accessioned around the same time, are all missing their collection information. And this includes the tiki-headed pounder. George Vancouver is another likely suspect. His voyage aboard the Discovery in 1791 to 95 was well known for its ethnological collections, although much of the associated documentation from the discovery was lost. And there's details from his crew members, like notes that they did collect things as well. And those collections are in the British Museum. And of course, Vancouver had sailed with Cook on his second voyage on the Discovery, which stopped at the Marquesas. But again, even his personal collections, the documentation is lost. We then have William Bligh's breadfruit voyages aboard the HMAS Bounty and then the Providence. And these were in 1789 and 1791. So Bligh had sailed with Cook, and then on his third voyage to the Pacific, perhaps could have been the collector. Bligh's association with the pounder could potentially also explain the misattribution to the West Indies. Excuse me. Bligh having been voyaging between the West Indies and the Pacific to bring back breadfruit. So taking an assemblage-based approach, I wanted to find as many pounders as I could in early collections, so from the 18th to the 20th century. Trying to find the Marquesan pounders in early collections, though, did prove difficult. And it seems there was potentially a withholding of the exchange of Marquesan pounders with Westerners for some time. So some of the earliest examples of pounders collected by British explorers are in the Pitt Rivers Museum and the British Museum. Overall, I found a total of 134 Marquesan pounders of various different forms, but only 18 being tuki-headed pounders. The other comparative early pounder I found was in the British Museum collection. This was collected in 1899 by the English explorer and philologist, Frederick William Christian. He collected this along with a phallic pounder and a coral pounder from Wahuka. And then, of course, I geochemically analysed these with a Bruker Tracer 3 SD PXRF. All the training data I used to compare them are from the GeoRock database and notably McAllister and Allen's 2017 paper. And I calibrated the results with 30 standard reference materials and 6 in-house standards. And of course, I used this proxy diagram, the PSWF, which is a great and powerful proxy for the TAS diagram, to have a look at some of these results. This axis here is a nice proxy for sodium and potassium, and here is a nice proxy for silica. All the pounders plotted all over the place, really, which actually is in stark contrast to the adzes, which grouped quite nicely together. So this sort of proves what we thought we knew already about pounders, that they're more opportunistically acquired from the landscape rather than quarried from sources like the adzes. Looking just at the tuki-headed pounders in a discriminant function analysis, they do all group to the Marquesas group. I then used strontium against rubidium, which is what McAllister and Allen had used in their paper. This does give, some separation of the island groups there. The pounders aren't really matching greatly to any of the groups here. And then adding in the georock data, which includes some of the southern islands. So McAllister and Allen's paper, mostly Nukuhiva and Iao. And then put this reference data on the PSWF diagram. And you do actually kind of get this nice separation here along the alkali measure of the basalts. So you have the southern islands tending to be more subalkaline, so you can get a nice separation. So it would kind of look like this on the map, and the pounders mostly grouping with the southern islands. So then I ran those through another discriminant function analysis. Again, this is just georock data, but we still got a pretty good result, I think, having the majority of pounders matching to Hiva-Oa. And, you know, there's a great grouping of pounders also from Tehuata, but, you know, I was hoping maybe there was a bit of a stylistic difference between them, but not really. Maybe you could say very slightly the eyes on Hiva-Oa are a little bit bigger. So is the mystery solved? Well, given that the Pitt Rivers Museum holds such a large collection from the Resolution voyage, it does seem likely that the tiki-headed pounder, you know, was one of these examples of fine carving acquired during the brief Western Polynesian cultural exchanges at Tahuhata between the 8th and the 11th of April, 1774. I mean, that's the nice story, right? But sourcing the tiki-headed pounder from the Pitt Rivers Museum, you know, could support this. The idea that pounders were then subsequently withheld from Western exchanges may also come into this consideration. And Cook wrote in his journal about how the crew had made exchanges for many Marquesan souvenirs, including examples of fine carvings, the best he had observed in Polynesia, before all exchanges were stopped after some highly prized red feathers from Tonga were exchanged for a pig. But we do also need to consider other possibilities still, because these results do also provide evidence that tiki-headed pounders were exchanged to other Marquesan islands, because this tiki-headed pounder collected by Christian from Wahuka matches to a source on Hiva-Oa. And it was quite nice to, you know, note in Christian's writings in his book that, you know, he often received passage aboard local canoes between the Marquesan Islands when his ship, La Course, was not available. So he's moving around with the material. It's a daily kind of movement of things and people. And thank you to everyone who has made this research possible.